Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to this week's episode of Spiritual Reflections. And we'll be discussing again racism in our world that we live in today. And the topic is, should we be saying Muslim lives matter? Now we have our three respected guests this week. We have Mustafa Qureshi from Jazeera Derneyi. And for those who don't know Mustafa Qureshi, he's a Turkish Cypriot historian and researcher on Turkish Cypriot and Islamic and cultural history. We also have Yusuf Ahmet, who's co-founder of Cyprus Islamic Association and a well-respected Turkish Cypriot researcher, and also he teaches and he gives lectures on Islamic studies. And we have from South London, Alimullah, who's a professional teacher, and we will be discussing racism in our world today. I will start with Mustafa Qureshi. Mustafa, welcome. Happy Sunday today. And it's nice to see you again.
Welcome. It's great to be back.
Thank you. And let's start with so I'll be asking you first of all. Last week we discussed racism in the community, and also we spoke about Malcolm X. Can you please explain to our viewers a little bit about Malcolm X's life and legacy, and what made him change, and also how did it have an effect on the Black movement in America?
Okay. I went through some of it again, but I'll explain perhaps in more detail this week, and I'll welcome any questions whilst I'm talking as well. So yeah, as I mentioned last week, Malcolm X, African American, he was brought up in turbulent times just after the end of slavery. There was still segregation, apartheid type system in America. So just to kind of give an idea of his upbringing, at the time you had separate cafes for blacks and whites, separate entrances for blacks and whites. There were specific institutions where blacks couldn't enter. So although they were free from slavery, they were very much still second-class citizens, and that was enforced by the state as well. To add to that, after slavery, many of the slave owners were actually given money to free, because they freed the slaves. They were given money to compensate for their losses. So you have hundreds of years of one class of people who have been privileged and have built up a nation at the expense of another group of people, in this case the black people. And after slavery was abolished, the black man now has to compete to get to a basic standard, but still has these obstacles in their way. And this was the upbringing in which this was the world in which Malcolm X came into. And seeing this oppression, he tried in school to better himself, but his teacher said that there's no point. What a black person isn't going to achieve anything, and as such, demoralized him, and he got into petty crime for a while, and as a result, he was put into prison. And we see this cycle. It's a story that's being told over and over, and even in 2020 in the USA. And even in the UK, it's unfortunate that we're seeing this repeated. We are seeing black and ethnic minorities who have a lot of potential, but are being put down. And they've been told that they need to be singers or builders or whatever else it may be, and not to kind of push to be the best that they can. And as a result of that, you're going to get crime. You're going to get gang-related activities. So yeah, Malcolm X was put in that position. He was put into prison, and rather than just sit down and waste his time, he thought he needs to better himself. And he started reading as much as he could. Any book that came in his way, he would read it. He even read the whole dictionary. So if we see his absolutely. If we see his talks after, he's very well spoken, and you would think he was someone who actually studied to a very high academic level. But it was at that time where we start seeing the appearance of black movements. And I mentioned last week that as a result of the racism that the black community experienced, we mentioned things like the white people would try and use Christianity, for example, or even science to kind of prove that they were superior to the black people. And as a reaction, the black movements, which were trying to better themselves, would come out with, no, the black people are better and the white people are lower in status, or are the devil and not human. So just mirroring the language of what they learned from the colonialist white community. And one of those movements which gained traction was what was called the Nation of Islam. And we have to be clear, the Nation of Islam has nothing to do with Islam itself, other than some rhetoric and symbolism which they use. So they would use the crescent and the star. They would use Muslim names. Elijah Muhammad, for example, one of the founders of that movement, again used Muhammad in the name as well. But they didn't practice Islam in a real way. So not only, we can't even say that they weren't Orthodox Muslims, but they weren't heterodox Muslims either. They were not in the Islamic religion at all. And I also mentioned last week that the reason that they named it the Nation of Islam, and the reason that they felt this affinity with Islam, and hence the symbolism which was used, was a result of historic findings, which has been proven. It's not controversial. It is fact that anything up to 30% of the black slaves which were taken and stolen from the African continent were Muslim. So many of them started taking Muslim names. Malcolm X, however, he put an X in his surname in the period in which, until he finds a name which is suitable for him, he would choose that name, X on his surname, to cross out the surname which was given to them, enforced on them by their masters. And their surnames, and many African Caribbean people to this day have a surname which is of English or other European origin. Of course, it's not an African name. Smith, and we had George Floyd, for example. Floyd is not an African name. It means that at one point their descendants were owned by someone with the surname Floyd or Smith or some other European name. And this is not appropriate for a free people. Malcolm X for many years was a spokesperson of the Nation of Islam. He was very prominent, and he would go on many talk shows. But after some time, he started to realize that the reality of this movement had some serious issues. For example, Elijah Muhammad was abusing many female members in the group, and he was having children out of wedlock, for example. And Malcolm X actually exposed this, because he was someone who was there for truth and justice. And his journey along the way took him to the Hajj pilgrimage. But on the way there, he stopped over in many Muslim countries, including many African countries as well. And it was on this journey where he saw that he wasn't just respected by the black Muslims, but he was also respected by Muslims with white skin. And he actually wrote a letter, Malcolm X's letter from the Hajj pilgrimage. It's very famous. I think it was sold for like millions of dollars, in fact, because it's something which is a milestone in African American history. In that letter, I'm not going to read it. I mean, I know Hussein Hodge actually posted this in the TCC group, and I'll be happy to post it again, and I would welcome others to read it and digest exactly what it says. But the synopsis of it is, he said that there was tens of thousands of pilgrims there, and there was black-skinned Africans from Sudan and there was another African nation which he mentioned, but there were also blue-eyed and blonde Muslims. And the treatment that he was given by both the blacks and the white-skinned Muslims was exactly the same. And in fact, in one point he says he was treated as a king.
Wow.
This is an African American who cannot even use the same toilet as a white person in his native America. And here he is, halfway across the world, among strangers. But the bond of religion, the bond of humanity, which Islam teaches us, treated him as a king. And in fact, there were many elite members that were there on the Hajj pilgrimage, and they would let him sleep on their beds We're talking about kings and elite members, and this was a descendant of a slave, a second-class citizen in his own country, and here he is being treated like a king because he's a guest, and Muslims are famed for their hospitality, regardless whether they're black or white. And as such, he came back, but he came back as an Orthodox Sunni Muslim. He knew that there was going to be trouble as a result of this, because the Nation of Islam was very much cultish in their behavior. And as with any cult, there is thuggery. And not long after that, he was actually assassinated. And it's most likely that the Nation of Islam was actually responsible for his murder. So I would encourage people to read the autobiography of Malcolm X and be inspired, and actually, you know, to add to that, to add it in context of what's happening now with the whole Black Lives Matter and such. I just want to highlight that Malcolm X did not restrict himself once he became an Orthodox Muslim to caring about just one particular group of people. And I know a lot of people are saying when Black Lives Matter, all lives would matter. But when Black Lives Matter, will that mean that the West Bank, which is being annexed by the Israeli forces now, when Black Lives Matter, will the West Bank and Palestine be free? We have situation now. We had Iyad al-Hallaq, a disabled Palestinian who was murdered by Israelis. We have in the UK, for example, I won't go on too much of a tangent, but I just want to try and, because as Muslims, we don't go to extremes. We try and be balanced. So we don't go to the extreme of being racist, but at the same time, we won't restrict ourselves to any movement or go into extremes, but we try and keep balanced. So Black Lives Matter, we totally agree with that and we support that movement. But we had a black 12-year-old girl, Shukri Abdi, who was being bullied in school just recently. And the parents informed the school that this bullying is getting really serious. And she was found recently dead in a river. She couldn't swim. And the way that that case has been hardly given any media attention, and any media attention that it has been given is by the Muslim lobby. But I see that our own community, the Turkish Cypriots, haven't given that, haven't highlighted the issue of Shukri Abdi. She's a young black girl. Does Black Lives Matter not matter for Shukri Abdi? And I'll give a statement by Malcolm X, who actually took on the name El Hajj Malik al-Shabbaz, because he found a name which was appropriate for him. He said, a man who stands for nothing will fall for anything. And the reason, I know I may not be popular in saying this, but I feel that our people have come to a point where they don't stand for anything. And because there's a hype now behind the Black Lives Matter movement, they're following the George Floyd case, which is an isolated case and it should be taken seriously. But in matters which aren't as popular, like the Shukri Abdi case, or the Iyad al-Hallaq case, or the 3 million Uyghurs who are still in Chinese camps, that case is being unfortunately ignored.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's so many wrong things in the world, and we do, as a community, every one of us who stands for human rights should be voicing our concerns at abuses against any nation, no matter what color or creed they are. Thanks for bringing up the case of the young girl that was found dead in the pond. I also want to just say that Malcolm X's letter from Mecca, it is very moving, and it is very it changed his life, didn't it? It changed the way he looked at things. And there's one quote where he says, "This might sound strange to all of you, but I've slept in the same bed, like side by side, with people that are blonde and white and blue eyes, and shared food with these people." And that's really important, because it just shows that we're all one nation, no matter what our colors are and our creeds are. Mustafa, let's speak a little bit about Muhammad Ali, because Muhammad Ali had a lot of challenges in life, and he was a very well respected person, not only by the black community, but by the world. In he was the name on TV for me when I was growing up. Everybody wanted to be like Muhammad Ali. How did Muhammad Ali change the whole spectrum on the black cause in America and across the world, actually. Can you explain a little bit about that for us?
He's a very interesting character, and he actually links in closely with Malcolm X. Muhammad Ali was originally known as Cassius Clay, and as we all know, he was a very esteemed boxer. He reached a very high level, and he actually had joined the Nation of Islam as well, but he had to keep it secret up to the point where he reached a certain level of fame. Otherwise, the whole media, the whole institution would have disowned him. He would have no chance at gaining the belt because the Nation of Islam was hated by all at the time. And he actually started off becoming a famous sportsman when he competed in the Olympics for America, right? So, I mean, we spoke earlier about how society has got an issue with a black person being a basketball player or boxer or rap artist. But they have an issue when blacks and ethnic minorities reach real positions of power and influence. And in the same case, Muhammad Ali, who was obviously raised in the same time and period when there was segregation in America, when they were treated as second-class citizens, the US and the white people within America had no issue with having a black man represent them in the Olympics as a boxer. And he actually gained the gold medal for America. And there's a famous story, I think he mentioned it in a report when he came and spoke on the BBC. He mentioned that he came back proudly and he had his gold medal around his neck, and he thought he's going to go to the local cafe in his town. And he went in there and he told them what he wanted. I think it was like burger or whatever it was. And the waitress said to him, "We don't serve blacks." And he responded saying, "Well, I don't eat blacks either," just humorously. And they had to actually call the manager, and in the end, they still refused to serve him. So he was good enough. He was American enough to represent the nation and win a gold medal for the nation, but he wasn't good enough to be served a burger in a cafe.
Oh,
it's really sad. It's really sad. And Malcolm X played a part in raising Cassius Clay, who later went on to call himself Muhammad Ali. He was the mentor of Muhammad Ali. They were very close friends as well. However, when Malcolm X spoke out against Elijah Muhammad, Muhammad Ali actually had disowned himself from Malcolm X, and they actually saw each other one time after that in Africa. And Malcolm X called out to him, brother Muhammad, and he was like, "Brother Malcolm, I can't associate myself with you because of you have gone against Elijah Muhammad." Muhammad Ali then became the representative and the spokesperson of the Nation of Islam. He took the place of Malcolm X. But he also eventually came to the conclusion that this is not true Islam. This hate and this racism, whether it's masked by white racists or black racists, ultimately it's racism and it's hate and it's anger. And hate just creates more hate. And as a result, he became a Sunni Muslim as well. And because we're talking to a Turkish Cypriot audience, it's also interesting to know that he's is very close and is very fond of Sheikh Nazim Kutusi. He has a photo with Sheikh Nazim.
And Erbakan as well. There was these kind of meetings with a lot top Turkish officials. Yeah,
that's right. He has photos with Necmettin Erbakan from Turkey. And what links him? What is Islam? It's mainstream Islam. It's mainstream Islam, which has opened the doors to him. So what he has done for the cause, in many ways, he's more famous than Malcolm X to the mainstream out there. He's acceptable to white people, and we have a name of Muhammad there, and we have the name Ali, who is someone we love and care for. He's a cousin of the Prophet.
Mm.
Ali. He chose these beautiful names for himself, and he streamed all around the world. And he's still alive. No, sorry, died, but he had Parkinson's towards the end of his life, most likely as a result of his boxing career. But the legacy that is left behind is still going on to this day.
Can I just add something to that? And we also saw how Malcolm X played a big role in helping other people from different backgrounds. So when the Gulf War broke out, he was the one who went to mediate for Western hostages to be taken out of Iraq. I remember that really
That's right.
clearly, like yesterday. So he went and
It
sat
wasn't.
with Saddam, and he done so much stuff for people.
It wasn't just for Muslim causes either. Muhammad Ali, when he was the world champion, it was a time when the Vietnam War broke out.
That's
And
right.
that was another unjust war out of many unjust wars that America's been involved with. And Muhammad Ali was meant to join the army. He said, I'm not going to go there. The Vietnamese have done nothing against me. It's an unjust war. I'm not going to go there and kill innocent people.
Mm.
And he lost his title as a result of that, but he didn't care. He's a Muslim. He has principles. He has values. He's not going to go and kill innocent people, regardless if they're Muslim or not. And I think that's something that we can all learn from as well. And when we say Black Lives Matter and when we care for George Floyd, it's those same principles that makes us care for George Floyd. He's a human.
That was really like refreshing to listen to, Mustafa. Lots of information about Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, and the people who are watching this show who are my age would. It's a time we grew up in the era of watching Muhammad Ali, and for Turkish Cypriots especially, Muhammad Ali was a big name because Muhammad Ali actually went on a lot of tours to different Muslim countries. There's famous pictures of him standing outside the Blue Mosque and rallies in Turkey. Yeah, I mean, he's done a lot for his people and to bring the plight of the American black people to the stage. And we here today, we ask Allah to be kind and merciful to him and grant him
Um,
place in paradise, him and Malcolm X and all those who struggled for their communities in that time. Mustafa, amazing stuff, amazing information you've given us today. And viewers, please do send us your questions if you have any questions. And as Mustafa said, do purchase books or go online, look at these remarkable people, what they've done, what they've achieved, their challenges, their struggles, because it was a really great struggle to be a black person and to be in the limelight as well. And these people actually went in prison as well for their beliefs and for
so,
their struggles. I've actually purchased many years ago both of my sons' books on Malcolm X and the biography of Muhammad Ali. Um, a really good read, and I still read them all to this day. Mustafa, just a last question before you go. Does racism exist in the Turkish Cypriot community and the Muslim community against black people or against anyone? Do we have a problem with racism in our own communities?
but first of all, racism is innate, just as there is evil innate in all human societies. All societies in the world have racism at various levels. It's in white communities, Chinese communities, it's in black communities. We have issues here where black people have issues with mixed race black people. It's everywhere. Now, we need to define the types of racism. If I give a blanket answer, we may we may impose our idea of racism as what we see in the USA or in the UK and say that yes, the same is prevalent in North Cyprus or among Turkish Cypriots. So is there racism in Turkish Cypriot society? Yeah, of course there is. Of course there is. Is it at the level of the UK or the USA? I would say no. I would say no. As someone who spent a lot of time in North Cyprus and most of my friends out there, most of the people I associate with are non-Cypriots, are foreign students or people who have actually made something of themselves. One of my close friends there, a Somalian from Somaliland, actually studied in Northern Cyprus and he's now a doctor and he speaks in seminars as well. So the issue is, I mean, people can perceive things in different ways as well. So I have an Egyptian student friend. He studied in North Cyprus, and when I asked him the question of is there racism in Cyprus, he said yes. And he gave me an example of when he goes to the bakkal and he speaks to them in English, they'll respond to him in Turkish. He understood that to be racism. And I was like, well, I have to stop you there. It's on you. The onus is on you to learn the language of the people, right? There are other examples. There's Palestinians who have been raised in the Gulf. And the Palestinians raised in the Gulf, although it's an Arab country, they are treated as second-class citizens. So when they go to Cyprus, the way our people speak can be a bit aggressive at times, even in government institutions. It's not that they are rude. It's not that they necessarily have something against you. Some may be arrogant, some may not be. But the culture of that country, and even us as Londralı, when we go to Cyprus, we experience people speaking harsh to us there. Is it because they're racist? Of course not. It's just the way that they speak. Sometimes I think that, you know, I've gone there, oh, do they think that I'm a foreigner? They're speaking funny with me. But even when I give it back to them and they understand that I'm Turkish Cypriot, they're still speaking harsh. So often things can be misinterpreted. Now, all of the students, many students in North Cyprus, especially the poorer ones, have issues. I've heard of, I mean, I won't explain in detail here, but there are Turkeli students, there are African, Arab, many others. Those that are poor are having difficulty. And it's not because, I wouldn't say it's because of racism, but I would say maybe because of the lack of infrastructure isn't there to support them. And we are seeing in the recent, the COVID epidemic, which was in Northern Cyprus, and thankfully we've recovered from that now. The foreign students some of them were going hungry. And your organization, Hojam, Cyprus Islamic Association, sent food over. The Cyprus Student Association in Cyprus went out and gave food to them as well. Local Cypriots were donating as well. Right, so there was a protest recently outside of the parliament, and there was like 4 or 5 black Africans who protested and said Black Lives Matter. Right, are they actually feeling that they are being oppressed because they're black people, or are they going along with the movement that's happening in the West and trying to superimpose that to gain rights within North Cyprus? It's hard to say, but the fact that out of there's a minimum of at least 30,000, maybe 50, I think it was more than 50,000 foreign students in Cyprus, and there was only about 4 or 5 people that were protesting there. I think that says a lot about what's going on there. A lot of them do need help. There is issues in Northern Cyprus regarding these foreign students. I wouldn't say the issue is racism, but there are other issues there. Can our people behave more respectful to our foreign guests? Yes, I would say so. I would say so. Can Turkish Cypriots be racist? Well, let's put it this way. Historically, we have had black Turkish Cypriots and white Turkish Cypriots and brown Turkish Cypriots, and they've all mixed, and there wasn't any issue with them getting married. Now, some Turkish Cypriots may say, well, my mum and dad don't want me to get married to a black person. Is that because they are from the black race, or is it because there is a cultural difference there? I'm not saying that it's right either way, but all I'm trying to put across is maybe mum and dad want someone who is culturally closer, and then the issue is not racism. So to wrap up, I would say we don't have a racism issue as the UK does, as France does, or the USA. We don't have that imperial history either. But there will be racists in North Cyprus, in South Cyprus, and all around the world.
Thank you so much. That was really enlightening to hear your views as well. And a lot of people can actually relate to what you're saying. And thank you once again, Mustafa, for coming on the show. And I hope to see you very soon again. Thank you. Yusuf Ahmet, how are you today?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show, Hodja. How are you?
No, it's really good. Yeah, really well, thank you. Just going from last week when we spoke about racism in the Islamic world and the Muslim community. Lots of questions have been asked to me about equality in Islam. So my question to you today, if Islam believes in equality of all people, why was slavery still around in the Islamic world? And are black people seen as non-equal to a white person or an Arab or a Turk maybe in the Islamic world? So the question is, if Islam believes in equality for all races and all colors and creeds, is there equality for black people in Islam?
Great. I'll deal with the first part of your question around slavery, which is quite a complex issue. I think the question partially presupposes that slavery wasn't or isn't abolished in Islam. Something that I'd actually like to question, because we're told time and time again that slaves did exist in the earliest Muslim communities, or that Islam actually condoned slavery. I'd like to spend a few minutes actually just defining our terms, because before we talk about whether Islam condones or prohibits something, we need to first understand what that thing actually is. So what do we mean when we talk about slavery? When we talk about slavery, it's emotionally packed. It's a very political word, very sensitive word, very controversial. When I hear the word slavery, it probably means very different things for different societies. Having studied sort of ancient Rome, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, China, it means very different things. I think for most people, when we hear the term slavery, we probably think of films like 12 Years a Slave and Roots, right? What a mentally scarring film to have watched when I was younger. Actually, these images seared the marks in my mind, that you'd see these African men, women, children being seized by ruthless slave traders, torn from their homes and from each other, families ripped apart, and it'd be packed like chattel into the whole into ships, slave ships as they were called, and then they would be taken and sold like cattle at an auction to white plantation owners, who basically worked, oppressed, lashed them mercilessly for the rest of their lives, and forced them to work, and were very cruel to them. And this is kind of like a massive sin that America had. The British Empire wasn't also free from this. They also had their role to play. And ultimately, slavery in this context means the reduction of a person, that is something that's against their will, that they are nothing more than a bit of property. They're owned by another person who has absolute rights over their labor and deprives them of their natural rights to freedom and family, right? So when we normally talk about slavery, this is normally what comes to mind because of our cultural baggage, because of what we've seen over the last couple of 100 years. But slavery, let's understand, what do we mean by slavery? And we can look at the English dictionary, we can look at different terms, how the word slave come to mean what it means, that it came from the Slavic, because obviously in the 13th century, you had all this trade movement that was moving through that region. But sometimes we define it in different ways. We say, okay, a slave is someone that is owned. Normally, this is the typical definition that we're given from the English dictionary, that somebody a slave is somebody that is the property of somebody else. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that in a moment. The other thing that we think about is it's someone that's not free. And then we start to think philosophically about, well, what does it mean to be free? What do we mean by freedom? Are any of us truly free? Then we might be thinking about abuse, that to have a slave is someone that you would abuse, whether that be psychologically, physically, or in other ways. And the question I'm asking is this really the defining terms as to what it means to be a slave? Because philosophically speaking, and many philosophers have spoken on this, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the great philosopher, in his book around social contract theory, was that man is born a slave but thinks that they are free, that we are all slaves in one way or another, perhaps a slave to the system, a slave to our society. None of us are truly free. We're all slaves in one respect or another. And from the Islamic perspective, the view is that actually we're all ultimately slaves or in submission to the highest being, and that is God. But coming back to what do we mean when we talk about slavery in this concept and this idea that slavery has been abolished, I actually don't believe that. I think we still have modern day slavery, unfortunately. And we see sweatshops and stuff existing around the world. But if we think of it as ownership, if it is, as the English dictionary says, slavery is where someone's owned by somebody else, what do we mean when we talk about ownership? What does it mean to own somebody or own something? And normally we understand that to mean a bundle of rights towards that thing. So you have the right to use it, you have the right to exclude it, to destroy it, to sell it off. Sometimes an owner may have all of those things, often with significant restrictions, and sometimes an owner might have like literally all of those things. But we probably wouldn't think of a child owning their toys, because they don't have the freedom to do with whatever they want with their toys. They're clearly not fully in control of those. But according to, let's say, for example, America, children do legally own the toys that we give them. But their ownership is not complete because their right to use them is highly restricted by their parents. So ownership is as much about how we imagine relationships as exercising real control. I think, was it Orlando Patterson, the famous historian, that pointed out, a social historian, that pointed out who and what we say we own is really only a matter of our customs and manners. And a lot of people would probably gasp at the idea of owning your children. But from the Roman through to the medieval period in Europe, parents could and did actually sell their children off as slaves to creditors, often to pay off debts. Poor parents would abandon their children, and this was a regular source for slave markets in Europe. And all of these children actually started off technically as free in the legal sense, but not legally owned by anyone. So ownership doesn't necessarily dictate that one is a slave. That's my point that I'm getting at here. Even when we talk about marriage, in the UK, a lot of women adopt the surname, the last name of the man. Why? Because the man would own the woman, that the woman is seen as the man's property, and that's why she would take his last name. This is a problem that we have in our society, where women, some would say that many women were treated as slaves, and treated as inferior to men. And actually, even if we look between sort of 1760 and 1880, what we're talking less than 150 years ago, there were around 218 cases where Englishmen would hold auctions to sell off their wives. And they'd even advertise these auctions in newspapers. But what does it mean to own a person? Does it mean to have full control over them? Like how I control this laptop or a mouse or a chair? What does this actually mean? What do we mean when we talk about freedom? When we usually think of slavery, we normally think of that as something that exists in a dichotomy with freedom. But what does it mean to be free? Almost no human being is actually free of dependence on others and on society as a whole. None of us are truly free. Almost everyone is forced to work. We might think that we have a choice in order to earn wages to buy food. So there is a deeper philosophical kind of view around what we mean by freedom, what we mean by slavery, etc. So let's now take this back to the Islamic perspective or the Muslim perspective. And what I would say here is that although we're told time and time again that slavery existed and it's condoned by the Islamic perspective, it's not in the sense that we understand slavery today. And I would probably question whether they were slaves at all. See, before Muhammad was there, yes, you could have people that were kidnapped, people that were, captured. And these free people would then become slaves, and you could go and you could sell them at an auction and get money for them. They wouldn't be able to marry other slaves. They wouldn't be able to marry non-slaves. They were treated as a completely different class. But that wasn't based on race. That wasn't based on the color of your skin. It wasn't if you're black, then you would be enslaved, as we saw with America in more recent centuries. It was more a case of class or what level you were at in society. And this did, in fact, exist. But Islam came to change all of that. And what we quickly saw was that in fact capturing a person became prohibited. You could not take a free person and make them into a slave. You could not kidnap a person. You couldn't go to a marketplace and buy someone or sell someone. That's haram. That's prohibited. That's impermissible. You cannot force slaves to be able to marry one another. A slave could marry a slave or marry a non-slave. That if a slave and a non-slave had a child, then that slave would pretty much become a free person. If their husband or their wife died, they would become free. The child would be free. In fact, many of the scholars that we know in Islam, Ibn Sirin and others, were actually the product of slavery. They were slaves or children of slaves. And Islam slowly began to abolish slavery. In fact, we saw in the Quran, there's a verse in chapter 24, verse 33, that, and if those who are in your possession ask for emancipation, then execute that emancipation, providing that you find good in them. Quite an important verse, in that if a slave no longer wishes to be a slave, if they're asking for emancipation, that you are obligated to free them on the basis that you find good in them. And we understand what that means as well. It's not, oh, if you think that they're a good person, or that you get to decide as the person that owns the slave whether they can be freed or not. But it was more around what they'll be able to provide for society. Because if you want to free a slave, you don't just pay for that slave and free them and let them off into the world. That's not how you free somebody. And so what Islam had is rehabilitation, social rehabilitation. And so what you would have, the only thing that continued to exist is where you would have criminals. And unlike today, where we have the prison system, where somebody could go into a still cell and they'd serve their time and they'd have rehabilitation and then enter back into society. There were no still prison cells back then. And rather than just killing these people, what they did is they brought those people into the families, and we call it slaves, but it's the wrong term. It's the wrong term. And this is where this whole confusion has come from. These people would join these families. They'd eat the same food. They'd wear the same clothes. They'd have to be treated with respect. They were not allowed to be given a derogatory name. They'd be able to go out and work. And if they wanted to be free, they could be free on the basis that they'd be able to go out and help society, to actually be skilled, to be able to actually go out and have a job. And it wasn't the individual that would decide that. It would actually be the court. It would be the society. It would be the hukumet, the council, if you like, that would determine whether they would be able to be freed or not. And freeing slaves, not just those that were brought into your possession, but freeing slaves in general, was such a recommended thing. It's almost an obligatory thing, to the point that when we give zakat, which we've spoken about before, zakat is this charity, if you like, that you give every single year. This zakat could be paid towards those that are poor, those that are needy, those that are in need of that money. But it can also be paid to free slaves. And what we saw with this verse that I spoke of from the Quran in the background, and Surah Al-Fatiha, where it says, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, that in you alone, God, do we worship, and in you alone do we seek help. This idea of a slave serving a master was quickly removed from society. And that's why Muhammad was given slaves, gifted slaves, but he never kept a slave. He freed all of them. And in his lifetime, upon whom be peace, he freed at least 63 slaves. His wife, Aisha, freed 67 slaves. His uncle, Abbas, freed 70 slaves. We know that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq freed many slaves. He would spend a lot of his wealth going out to go and buy slaves and free them. We saw that Hakim bin Hizam, he freed 100 slaves in his lifetime. Abdullah ibn Umar freed 1,000 slaves. Abdurrahman ibn Auf freed 3,000 slaves. Uthman ibn Affan, the third Khalifa, the third successor after Muhammad, upon whom be peace, freed 20,000 slaves. And astonishingly, even Dhul Kila al-Himyari freed 8,000 slaves in one day. And if I just add up those small examples that I'm giving you here, that's around 32,000 slaves that were freed just by those 8 individuals. But Muslims were going out looking for slaves, purchasing them with their wealth, and then freeing them back into society, because this was how Islam came to abolish slavery. And so the only, as I mentioned, the only thing that remained was criminals or prisoners of war. And these people were given the right to buy back their freedom or to become free. And this was done via a certain agreement, which is called mukatabat. And mukatabat is essentially where the criminal would demonstrate that actually they are reformed, they've got a job, they're skilled in that job, they're skilled in that trade, they're earning money from that trade, which is their own money, and they would give a portion of that money to the person that they were staying with, and they would be freed. And the way to look at it is more like that person was more like a child in a household. That as a child in a household, you're receiving accommodation, you're receiving food, you're receiving clothing, you're receiving shelter, you're receiving education. But you're given, but I mean, we wouldn't think of our children as slaves, right? Even though they can't go out and do whatever they want. They have to abide by the rules of the house. They have to follow and obey their parents. In the same way, that's what we're talking about here, that these criminals, these prisoners of war, would have to abide by the household rules. And so when they were finally released, that they were equipped to be released. And they were never ever treated as as badly as we see sort of in America. So in no way, shape or form am I condoning slavery. My point here, just to be very clear, is that I don't believe that what existed back then was slavery. I believe it was a measure that was put in place in the absence of prisons to try and bring criminals back into society by bringing them into families where they can have social reform, by giving them a job, giving them the same food that they would eat, the same clothing that they would clothe themselves with, and slowly releasing them back into society. That's how you free slavery. And this would happen. Unfortunately, hundreds of years later, and I'm not going to stand here and say that Muslims never practiced slavery. They did. That's what I just spoke about before is what Islam teaches. Islam teaches that we are all but slaves to God, that no one has the right to own somebody else. But Muslims, so-called Muslims, under the name of Islam perhaps, would go out and enforce slaves onto others. And this is clearly wrong. This is clearly misguided and is not in keeping with the teachings of the Islamic principles of equality, of justice, or this idea that in fact God is the ultimate owner, sovereign of all of everything that has been created. So yes, there are Muslims who have done heinous crimes and done many bad things throughout history. And all I can say is that those people do not adhere to the core principles of the Islamic tradition, which does abolish slavery. So I think that Islam did, and the framework that it provided, and we're talking 1400 years ago here. You know, we look up to people like Martin Luther King Jr. and others who've spoken out against who've spoken about equality and spoken out against slavery, etc. 1400 years ago, we have a man called Muhammad who's speaking out against this. And on your final point was around black lives and how are black people viewed in the Islamic tradition? Are they treated as inferior? And I kind of touched upon this on our show last week, but some of the most respected and honored individuals throughout history were black people from the Islamic perspective. The most mentioned individual in the entire Quran was a black man, and that was in fact Musa alayhi salam. That the majority opinion is that Adam alayhi salam was in fact black. Sulaiman, Hajar, the great ancestor of Muhammad. And there is even views that Jesus could have potentially been black amongst some of the companions of Muhammad, and Dhul Qarnayn as well, another controversial figure. Who is he? But Muhammad went on to say that that a non-Arab does not have any rights over an Arab, and an Arab does not have any rights over a non-Arab. A white does not have any rights over a black, and a black does not have any rights over a white. And that we should only, what distinguishes us is our taqwa, and that is our consciousness of God. And none can judge that except for God, right? Because who else can judge how conscious we are of God other than God, God Himself? So, irrespective of the color of our skin, irrespective of our race or our social background, what distinguishes us as human beings, as individuals, is what's in our hearts. And God alone can judge what's in our hearts. And we, as individuals, cannot be racist to one another. Racism did exist early on, and Muhammad spoke out against it. And he corrected people. And even during his prophet, during his message, during his life, people would sometimes say racist phrases or have racist actions, and he would speak out against it. And he would make sure that racism would also be eradicated. And so in summary, I believe that Islam abolished slavery. I believe that Islam abolished racism, that Islam gave us principles such as equality, justice, love, compassion, mercy. And these qualities, these principles are what we need to return to today, irrespective of whether we're Muslim or not. And one doesn't have to believe in God or be Muslim to recognize these principles. For deep down inside of us, within our fitrah, within our innate disposition, we can apprehend these, we can recognize these. Whether you believe in God or not, you still have some connection to God's nature. And these attributes are embedded within God's nature and are what distinguishes us from, other animals and other beings.
Beautifully put. And we know, I think the viewers, lots of comments on that as well. I just want to pick on a few points that you mentioned, Yusuf. So from my understanding as well, even the Prophet Muhammad, before he was given prophethood and he marries his beloved wife Khadija, and she gives him a gift, which is a slave. And the first thing he does, he actually gives Zayd, which becomes his foster son. He gives him his freedom, doesn't he? And Zayd's parents come, and he's an African slave. And Zayd's parents come, and Zayd tells his parents, "Do you know what? I don't really want to go back home with you guys. I'm staying with the Prophet Muhammad. I'm staying with Muhammad and his wife." And he fosters him. And he also, Zayd also marries another slave that the Prophet Muhammad gives her freedom, and she's his nurse. It's his mother's chambermaid. So we've got all these kind of, and just for our viewers to know, Yusuf gave a very, very beautiful explanation about slavery and the equality of black people in Islam. I've mentioned this time and time before. So anytime you visit a Muslim country or you hear the call of prayer, which is called the azan, just remember the first person to call the prayer was a black person called Bilal from Abyssinia, who was terribly persecuted and was one of the first earliest Muslims and one of the closest companions to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Also, there was another thing that you mentioned, that in the early times of Islam, when Islam was first created, we actually see Islam spreading to Africa, don't we? So we see large amounts of North and Sub-Saharan Africa convert in mass to Islam. So Islam, people in that part of the world were accepted into the faith, and we see large numbers of people in the subcontinent Asia, where Christianity actually comes into Africa at a much later stage, although there was Christian pockets in Ethiopia, but most of Central Africa was very primitive. But Islam is the most dominant religion in that period, and that's again. There's another thing that you did point out, Yusuf, that I'd like our viewers to know, that when you said later on in Islamic history, there was people, unfortunately, that did take up slavery. But we have to also remember, for our viewers who are watching, that it was not only black people that would be taken slaves. So I can give you one example: is the Egyptian Caliphate at the time, and Egypt, of course, is an African country, and most of the Egyptians, they're like 50-50. They're like Afro-Arab people. So there's lots of people from Nubian backgrounds, and they actually enslaved Turks. Turks were taken there as slaves. So the Mamluks were the descendants of Turkish slaves taken to Egypt, and they were slaves for the Egyptian Caliphate at the time, and they actually their rank went so high that they actually became the rulers of the nation. So slaves that became rulers of the nation. If you ever go to Cairo, any of you, you go to the Ibn Tulim Mosque, that is just one fine example how the slaves who built the mosque then eventually became the rulers of the Muslim world. Thank you so much, Yusuf. Lots and lots of interesting stuff that you went over today. Really, really things that I didn't even know about. If any of you, the viewers, are watching and there's questions that you'd like to ask Mustafa Qureshi or Yusuf Ahmed, please send your messages and we'll try to get them answered at the end of the show. We're going now over to Ali Mullah from South London, who's a teacher. And my question to you, Ali, a very, very important question, because this is one of the most important questions, not only for Turkish Cypriots, but for people that live in the UK. As a teacher, how do you deal with racism at school? Because we just heard from Mustafa Qureshi about this young black girl that was completely bullied and racially abused, and then eventually she was found dead. So how do teachers or how do the school deal with racism at school?
Hi, first of all, assalamu alaikum. Yeah, it's a really important question. I think when the issue of, for example, something like racism or any kind of other sort of discretion in school, whether it's violent or some form of bullying, all schools will have a behavior policy, and all teachers will sort of have to go down the line of following what the procedure is. However, in this case, or in the case of racism, which is the predominant subject at the moment, and it should be, of course, I find that the wider society is an issue, and even even within schools, what's kind of accepted is it's something that we have to overcome. Let's look at, for example, we have a prime minister who has we can, I don't want to get too political about it, but then again, this is a political subject, really. We can look at, for example, our current prime minister,
Absolutely.
who has a long list of racist things he said, whether it's about Muslims, whether it's about for example, black people, and I don't want to read them out, but it goes to show that there is an accepted level of racism that we need to overcome. And for schools, this is this is very important for schools to be able to tackle this. And there's a few ways of doing it. So, in fact, before I move on, and I just want to say as well, if we put aside our prime minister, for example, look what our media is doing. Not too long ago, I was really surprised actually, because in the Daily Mail they said something along the lines of they mentioned that Romanians were heroes because they had come over to pick vegetables and fruit, and that was, for me, that was really astonishing, because it's such a turnaround from the tone and the language used in our tabloids before that. So how do we expect kids to come to school, and what kind of, when there's so much accepted racism in society, then there is a lot for schools to tackle, but they're coming in with a lot of baggage. So we don't know what they're coming in from home. We don't know what the culture at home is. You don't know what the culture of, or we do know the culture of the media, and we know it's quite inherently racist. It's very hard to deny that. It's quite, I'm not sure. I'm going to be hand on heart. I haven't watched the news today, but my guess is that we were driving earlier, and I asked my wife, I said, look, can you please check the news for something for me? And we've had the riots that have been documented, and the sort of the Black Lives Matter protests. I shouldn't say riots. And I was wondering, I thought, did the far right movement that happened yesterday, how was that highlighted? How was that documented on the news? And I said, I'll tell you what, please have a look at the BBC for me. And she did. And she said it's not there. She's maybe the pages we looked at, it wasn't there. But it goes to show that it's what's presented to us is very skewed. So when this is the media that we're looking at, whether it's, you know, BBC Broadcasting, for example, is our national news network, isn't it? And if that's not documenting issues, and our tabloids are saying very racist things, and our prime minister is saying very racist things, and obviously, you know, our kids come from families that have listened to this media, and probably a lot worse sometimes, God forbid, but they come into school with that baggage, and then it's up to us to sort of turn that around and you know, make it really clear that sort of that accepted racism is not just saying, you know, I hate black people, I don't like Indian people, whatever. It's a lot wider than that, and there's a lot to digest there, isn't it? It's not simple just to say, yeah, schools will tackle this.
It must be quite difficult and challenging at times as well, especially when there's like racial tension in the air, and especially at the moment. So if schools were open, it'd be quite a difficult time to be dealing with, wouldn't it?
It would be interesting, to be honest. It's a shame that we're not in school, because you know, all the people I've worked with have been tremendous teachers, and you know, I've witnessed so many of my colleagues sort of challenging things that are stereotypes, and I've worked with brilliant individuals, so I wouldn't say that there's a problem with the teach force that I work with or I have worked with. So in that respect, yeah, there is a lot of work to be done, but I can see that, you know, our people, our staff, our teachers are doing these things. But there's more to it. So there's about how we educate our kids as well, and what makes part of our curriculum. So, for example, you know, as a computer science teacher, I could say that, you know, within my subject, I could just teach how to do something, you know, and with computing, a lot of the time it's do this and do this, and this is how this procedure is worked out. But there's a lot of history behind it as well, and I do go into as much effort as possible to bring that history out, because, you know, we have a lot of students that will come to school, and sometimes they're disconnected from all the different cultures in the world. And it's not enough to say that, okay, you know, we're here in a British school, why do other cultures matter? But that's, you know, to be fair, to be fair, even as you know, sort of white English students, it matters just as much to them as well at the end of the day. So when we look at, for example, myself in computer science, I would argue, you know, someone really important like Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi is such an important figure, not for me because he's Muslim, but because of the advancements made by him, who was such an important Persian mathematician from, you know, what is known as Uzbekistan today. But, you know, there wouldn't be a computer without him. You wouldn't be able to send a text message. A lot of the maths that we have, you know, it would be non-existent. So to not touch on these subjects, and I do make a point that, you know, I do make a point of going through this. So when I teach kids binary of the zeros and ones and stuff, I go into the point that, you know, look, before we use the numbers that we use today, and you know, we don't even refer. I remember when I was a kid, I remember hearing the fact that the numbers that we use were referred to as Arabic numbers. We don't hear that so much anymore. Now we hear about the base 10 system or the decimal system. So I do go into the effort of sort of going through the history of it, and that's me as a computing teacher trying to, you know, put some of the history across, because I think that it's very valuable for us to know that what we know hasn't been achieved because of, you know, what our current knowledge is. You know, hundreds of years ago, what was being discovered and what was being shared at the time is what's led to, you know, our current state of knowledge now. So that's, you know, from my perspective as a computer science teacher, I would say, you know, that's one way. But then, you know, curriculum wise, we have a lot of work to do as well. So, and I'm not a history teacher, so I can't go out and say too much about that. It's not within my field. But, you know, we were sitting down, my wife and my son, we went to their parents' evening, and, you know, he's really interested in history. And when we talked about, you know, what kind of, you know, what would be on a GCSE curriculum, because we were talking about the possibility of him choosing these options. And when we spoke about that, the history, I think from what I understand, what I remember hearing is that 40% of the history has to be sort of very British history. And then outside of that as well, I'm not sure how flexible, the flexibility there is to sort of touch on other world history. So I'm not so sure. But when we spoke about what might be there, it's a shame that none of it sort of relates to us. You know, growing up, I don't know about yourselves, but I had no knowledge of Ottoman history or Turkish history or Muslim history at all. So, you know, later on, discovering that actually a lot of our science, a lot of our medicine, a lot of our astrology, and mathematics has actually come from the discoveries of the classical age in Islam, and how that was shared with the rest of the world. So when we spoke about it with his teachers, and as I say, I'm not a historian, I'm not a history teacher. I don't have much control over what's taught and, you know, what I would be in those lessons. But there's a lot of work to be done. And the problem is a lot of our history is whitewashed. So, you know, when we look at, for example, when we look at particular maths and science discoveries, sometimes we just leave out the fact that actually the root wasn't that European scientist or that European mathematician. You know, there's examples of particular mathematicians that have literally taken directly from the advances made in the Middle Ages of Islam, and literally diagrams are copied, and the only thing that's happened is, you know, letters that have been taken away. Maybe they've changed a dal, which is an Arabic letter, and they've used a Latinized D in the diagram. Yeah, and very famously as well, you know, the fact that we use X in maths literally comes from the fact that when X, well, in Arabic they used to use the word shay, which, you know, starts with is the letter sheen, and because there wasn't a Latinized version of the sh, they used an X, which was the closest letter they could, and that's, you know, it's become where that means thing. We've used that as the unknown, and, you know, it relates back to what Mustafa said earlier about Malcolm X as well. So when he used the surname X, it was to state the fact that it was the unknown. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, and we could really do a lot more sort of putting different cultures of the world to the forefront. You know, when we say history is whitewashed, even though it's now commonly accepted that, you know, Christopher Columbus never discovered the Americas, how common is it that it was probably a black individual that discovered the Americas, or first sailed from Africa and you know, discovered the civilizations there? How common is that? It's not. We don't know about Muhammad Musa. You know, we don't, do we? And there's such a history there that's not touched on. We talk about the fact that, well, we don't talk about the fact that, for example, when Muhammad Musa, Mensa Musa, wasn't it? Musa Mensa.
Yes.
Yeah, when Mensa Musa, you know, discovered the South Americas, he left a trail of riches because he had come with ships of gold and silver and food, and there was a trail of riches that followed him from where he first set foot in South America to the sort of Central Americas and the Caribbean. And why isn't, you know? Yeah, please go ahead.
No, can you let the viewers know where Khan Musa was actually from in Africa?
I believe it was Mali, wasn't it?
It was Mali, yes.
I believe it was Mali.
He's the same Musa Khan Musa that does the pilgrimage, the great pilgrimage to Mecca from Africa, and brings like half of the nation with him. Yeah, and it's very, very recorded in history with all the gold, and, you know, he's one of the richest men and a powerful leader.
Interesting. They say that the economy of Egypt at the time, I think, was in such huge decline for 7 years after his pilgrimage, because of the amount of gold that he pumped into the society as he made that pilgrimage. So yeah, there is a lot that we don't know about, and this is important history, because a lot of our students here in this country would be from, you know, different ethnic minorities. They would be Indian, they would be African, they would be, you know, for example, in our case, Turkish or Turkish Cypriot, and we don't really know about this. We don't really hear about it, and it's a shame that we don't sort of share that knowledge. You know, if we're talking about Black Lives Matter today, we should also be talking about the fact that, you know, we have to share the achievements of Black and other, you know, other ethnic minorities' successes in history.
Thank.
Yeah.
So I was gonna, I was gonna actually ask you about a question, just out of curiosity. I mean, what kind of what are history lessons like now at school? And because same with when I was going, so it was like 60% of British monarchy history, and then a little bit about the Second World War, but there was never ever any mention about the subcontinent in India, a place where the British ruled for over 300 years, and a lot of Africa was colonized by the UK, by the British colonial powers, but we don't ever hear about Black African history or Indian history, and I think it's really important. And you just brought up the King of Mali, which some people know him as Musa Khan Musa, who they actually believe actually went all the way down to South America, and very powerful, very rich man, changed the economy of the whole of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula. Thanks for sharing that. One last question to you, Ali. Well, two questions really. How are we going to educate children? And does racism exist in the Turkish Cypriot community? Because there's a very large Turkish Cypriot community in South London. So maybe you can't speak on behalf of the Turkish Cypriots in North London, but the Turkish Cypriot community that you see at the school, that you know in South London, do they have a problem with racism against maybe Black people or other people from a different background?
Okay, let's try and break up your questions to two. So the first one, how would we educate, our kids today? I kind of touched on the fact that I don't think we have enough in terms of curriculum. And your previous question was, what does a history lesson look like today? I think it would be unfair for me to comment on that since I'm not really a history teacher. But I think from what I understand is we are taking a different approach in history lessons than maybe we were 20 years ago. So I remember what my history lessons were like. I studied history for GCSE. And I would say that it was very sort of textbook from the time. And I don't want to be overly critical of those times either. But as far as I understand, I think there is a different approach in terms of, the way we portray people like William Churchill, for example. And I think nowadays both sides of a coin is looked at more in depth. So, and this is from what I hear and what I understand from the students that I've spoken to as well, because I am interested. And I do ask them sometimes, what kind of things they learn in history, and I've spoken to history teachers as well. But I don't teach and I don't know. But I would say that the approach is different than what it was 20 years ago. And, it's very important as well, because the issue of, for example, someone like William Churchill was, when we really think about some of the statements he's made in history and some of his actions and, the cost of lives it has to, for example, the Indian subcontinent, what really differentiates him from someone like Hitler? How different was he really? But he's so glorified in British politics and history. So it's important that, these things are addressed. I would say that the way we go forward educating our children now is we go about making sure that our curriculum really represents everyone. And, we go further and make sure that it's not as whitewashed as it is now. Funny enough, what came to mind earlier was when we were talking about histories and, Mansa Musa making his way to sort of Central America. One of the discoveries, I think, from what I understood, was he had interactions with the, Native Americans of America. And when the story and the narrative we hear about the Europeans who came across these people was that they were very savage, very basic. Their clothing was sort of literally maybe a piece of leather covering their private parts. But it's also been documented that they also lived in 2 to 3 story buildings. And, there were evidences as well that from the time possibly of Mansa Musa, I'm not so sure, from that time, it's possible that tribes of Indians had also accepted Islam. And there were evidences of their clothing. And for example, how they had adapted their clothing slightly. And I'm not going to say drastically, because I think the way they're portrayed isn't completely accurate. So they adopted it so that women, for example, had a hijab and the man covered, from chest to sort of knee. And there was examples of that. And it's not as primitive as they always make it out to be. And I wouldn't say that at all. These are people with, just as much dignity as anyone else. It's just that history is written in such a way that it kind of makes it acceptable for these people to have been taken over. I've got Pakistani and Indian friends, for example, that will tell me that, actually the British coming to India was a great thing. They built things like the railways, and they really sort of advanced the country. But when you think about it, the railways were built so that it could service themselves. It benefited themselves to sort of ship things to the ports a lot easier, and share the wealth back to England. So yeah, history can be very sort of distorted, and as they always say, it's written by the winners. Coming to the second part of your question, I'm not sure I'm so. I may not be qualified to answer that question, but I would say, similar to what Mustafa said earlier as well, is that I don't believe that we are racist in the same way. And I would say that there is racism amongst us, but what is the racism? It's hard for me to say this because I don't want to justify it in any way. There is racism in Cypriot societies. I believe that as well. But is it the same as what we have here? And racist in what way? And I'll give another example. For example, when you speak to Turkish Cypriots at the moment, they have a different view of people that come from different countries at the moment. And it's because such a huge amount of people, such a huge influx of people have come from different countries. So if you look at Cyprus at the moment, there is a large proportion of Russian people. There's a large proportion of people from Persia. And you find that people are worried for different reasons there. So with the huge influx of people from Persia, for example, or Russia, or even the students from Turkey, and the amount of migrants that have stayed there, one of the worries that they might have is that, Turkish Cypriot culture is really quickly becoming diluted. And maybe that's a worry. It's not an excuse, is it, in any way? But I from what I see at the moment, is that something that's going on. And I wouldn't say that's because, the reason I'm pointing that out is because I don't think that racism that happens is particularly towards black people. Someone like us, for example, we live in London. When I go back to Cyprus and I see, oh wow, it's such a cultural hub now, I'm excited.
I love it.
I love it. Yeah, I love walking down the street and being able to hearing people speak Arabic, or hearing someone speak a different language from different parts of the world. And there are so many Pakistani students and Nigerian students. For me, that's exciting. I love to see that's become so multicultural. But this is something. This is a fact of society, isn't it? People are sort of people are frightened of challenge by change. So yeah, I do believe it exists, but I'm not so qualified to say why or how much, or to give a real explanation on it, to be fair.
Thank you so much. But your last point, I can actually relate to that, because when I go to Cyprus, it's one place I love to do. Is the nearest town to me will be like Malta. And I used to really not like Malta as a kid. It was like boring, because when I was a kid, it was just the old town. Now it's spread out. But I love going to Malta now, especially like evening time, and just wander through the cafes, and maybe just do like a cafe stuff. And you see so many people, you actually feel like you're still back in the UK. You're very multicultural, and listening to people's conversations, and actually you do see this kind of brotherhood. You don't see people just sitting. You see people actually sitting together. Well, I've seen that. I've observed that, and I've just been in. That's where I've actually networked with a lot of people as well. So most of the people that I've worked with and managed to network with is actually going to these cafes and just randomly talking to like a Jordanian or Somalian or a Sudanese brother or something, and it's just quite fun because you meet Pakistanis and Bangladeshis, and it's just there's quite solidarity there as well. So that's a good point.
It's definitely great to see the mosque in the evenings as well. So, like you said, places like Mausa, I love Gulseren as well. Gulseren is a lovely hotspot where sort of people are sort of up and down all night. But just checking the mosque out in the evening, and you see the different groups of people that attend. It's nice to see that those cultures mix together, and like you said, there's unity there. But if I could just touch on one more topic as well, Mustafa mentioned earlier
We've got
about.
we've got some questions as well, so we'll
Yeah,
definitely go through the messages as well after you're
yep,
finished, Ali Jim. Tamam.
we'll do. So one of the things Mustafa mentioned was maybe the culture there is different, even towards us. So for example, we coming from London, we see the attitudes of people are very different. And I thought about this for a while, and I used to sort of not enjoy going so much because I could see that there's a different culture in the way sort of people speak. And one of the things that always stands out to me is that you might go to a supermarket, and where we live in a very capitalist society in England, we're very used to this culture of service and how you treat the customer and things like that. Whereas it's not so much over there. It's still very laid back, and capitalism hasn't really sunk into that society in the same way. So you can go to the checkout, and wherever you might expect that in the UK, the customer is going to be focused on you. Sorry, the checkout clerk is going to be focused on you. Whereas over there, it might be very much that you're giving your money across, but they're having a conversation with a person 2 tills further down the line, if that makes sense. And there's that conversation going on there, and the money's just chucked across at you. And it's not because I don't believe it's because they don't like you or they're racist or they see you as they're challenged by you because you're from abroad. It's just maybe that capitalist culture hasn't sunk in the same way, and I don't really want it to anymore either. I kind of accept the way that is, and I accept that when I go there, that's how things are, and I kind of look at it warmly now as opposed to being insulted many years ago. Maybe you guys have had similar experiences.
No, I used to actually question it before, but after visiting places like Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, I actually feel Cyprus is just a very laid back, very Mediterranean culture. You see the same thing in Sicily. You go to buy a loaf of bread, woman just chucks you the coin back and not even a thank you. So I'm not generalizing, but so it's quite normal. It's like that very, very Mediterranean laid back society, which makes Cyprus. Can I just go through some of the messages? Lots of messages. Gulay and Sheniz Raif are watching. Also, I just want to make a quick statement. So probably the program next week will be sometime in the middle of the week. The reason being is that Eurogauge TV, which is a TV channel that we actually work closely with, and we're very friendly with the people on Eurogauge TV. They have a program on Sunday evening, so we don't want to clash with any of the major TV stations because they're all doing great work as well. So we'll probably do something in the middle of the week which won't clash with any TV channels. So if Gulay is watching, that's my message to Gulay. I also spoke to my Tanch Abi and made that very clear that that's why we brought the program forward today to 4 o'clock, so it doesn't clash with their program, because that's very important for their programs to be also heard. Chanel Ranges Balletti sends her love. Chanel Ali talks about the letter of Malcolm X, and she said the letter is beautiful, definitely something to watch. And also Chanel says, yes, agreed. There is so much going on that we also need to focus on. We need more of a voice together so we can stand in power. The media is poison, and most of the time that's the problem. We need the truth to be voiced more, and not what's on the British news, of course. They only tell us what they want us to hear, obviously. We are just wrapped up in the Western news and politics, not enough about ethnic minorities. So true. Mehmed Ali says, so true. That was to you, Ali Mullah, and also Ibrahim Gonje, thumbs up. He was agreeing with you. Seville Ali Oğlu says, very interesting. Thank you for these sessions. Zera Akarsu says, absolutely, Ali. Each individual teacher can do bits and pieces here and there, but the curriculum in schools needs to be changed and be more balanced around the world. North Cyprus is obviously not exempt from this. I'm glad to hear that this is being discussed here, but what is being done about it now? ? You may have mentioned already. I've just tuned in. Please do actually watch this again if you've just come halfway through, and share it on your Facebook. The program is really just to benefit our community. And Seville, Zera Akarsu, I totally agree. When I was listening to Ali Mullah about the curriculum in this country. I think it goes for a lot of countries as well, and Cyprus included. I think we do need to know more about our history. It shouldn't be one-sided. We should know about every part of our history, good or bad. Seville Ali Olu says, back in my days at school, the teachings were of English past. As a child, I felt that white was superior and I had an obligation to obey them. I remember those days. I remember, yeah, I totally agree with you there. Zera Akarsu again, my view is that racism is racism, regardless of where in the world. Yes, different aspects of it plays out in Cyprus and other parts of the world. However, ignorance is ignorance. I totally agree. And Zera Akarsu, two more messages. There is unconscious bias and white supremacy. We all need to be more aware of this in how we, as in the Turkish people, may also be inherently racist. I totally agree with that. I think racism or prejudice can be found in most communities. Guys, we've been on here for 1.5 hours. A really, really good debate, and this could go on for weeks and weeks because it's something, it's in the headlines. It's making headlines. People will want to talk about this. These were subjects when I was a kid you could not talk about. We did suffer racism. I lived in East London. I saw racism against Jewish people. I saw racism against the Asian community. I also saw racism against Turkish Cypriots and other Cypriots. So we all have had our taste of racism. I just want to go over a couple of things, maybe ask a couple of questions. Now, the other day on Afro Cypriot page, and if you're watching this and you're a Turkish Cypriot with maybe with African descent, or your grandparents or grandfather or grandmother was maybe from African descent, if you feel that way, there is a page on Facebook called Afro Cypriots. Do follow it and do try to participate and contribute to the page. It's really interesting. It's really inspiring as well. Share your pictures of your heritage there. We should be proud of our heritage, whatever it is, whatever background it comes from. I actually posted a photograph from the late part of the Ottoman Empire the other day. The reason why I was really interested in the photograph, it showed a very fine, handsome-looking black Cypriot, Turkish Cypriot guy on a horse as a policeman. Now, if you can read through the picture, it teaches you a lot. A black Turkish Cypriot policeman in the later part of the Ottoman Empire, it would never be dreamed of in the West to see anyone from African or black descent in a position like that. We also have lots of pashas in the Ottoman history that had the title Arab Ahmed or something like that, or Gara Hassan or Gara Ali in the Ottoman Empire. So people did actually maybe they were servants or slaves, whatever they were, but they actually worked up into the ranks of the elite in the Ottoman Empire and other dynasties around the Islamic world. I just want to ask a quick question to Yusuf very quickly. Yusuf, do we have a lot of scholars from the African or black heritage in Islam?
Yeah, we have loads. In fact, there was quite a lot of scholars that were sort of born. We spoke about slavery earlier, that were born sort of from sort of a slavery background, etc. But there's loads and loads of African scholars that we can refer to even today. So a great example is Ahmed Tijan, who many people sort of look up to. And so many more. I don't know why my mind's gone blank, but it's just sort of on the spot. But yeah, there's so many. In fact, in America, of course, Imam Zaid Shakir, somebody that I take a lot of knowledge from. You've got Professor Sherman Jackson. I have a lot of respect and I listen to a lot of his lectures today. Many people, because in reality, it doesn't really matter what color skin you have or what background you're from. There are Muslims of all color, racial backgrounds, cultural heritages. We've got Chinese Muslim scholars, Russian Muslim scholars, Albanian Muslim scholars, English Muslim scholars as well. Abdul Hakim Murad, for example, also known as Timothy J. Winters. It's almost irrelevant as to what the color of someone's skin is, because from an Islamic perspective, that's not what we look at. And you see this when you go into a mosque. Probably one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen, actually. I'd heard time and time again that Islam eradicated and abolished racism, but I only truly experienced that when I walked into a mosque one day and I saw shoulder to shoulder, everyone facing the same direction. Black person from maybe African background, Caribbean background. You had Arab people, you had English people, you had people of all different nationalities. They were all praying in a uniform way, and they all had love for one another and treated each other as brothers and sisters as well at the back. So what other community do you know where they put aside all of the colour and everything and treat each other like brothers and sisters? I've never come across a community like that, but I do believe that Islam in practice has eradicated racism, and I've seen and experienced that firsthand.
I want to share something very quickly with you as well. So when I was 19 and when I was 21 and I went to the first time to the pilgrimage, which was actually the Hajj, and being a shorty, as I am quite short in height, I was in Mina doing the stoning of the pillars, the stone of the Jamarat, and I was quite short. And then you see all these I was in the midst of these Nigerians and people from Congo, and they're like really, really tall guys, and I'm getting like squashed. And all of a sudden, this Nigerian guy just picks me up, I didn't understand what he was saying, but I understood. It's like, go on, just do what you have to. He just picked me up and put me down, kissed my forehead, and you had that kind of brotherhood. And like I was, although I've got from African origin, but you would never know that I have African or Arab origin because I'm quite fair skin. And I saw that kind of love and solidarity where people are praying side by side. So I actually understand where Malcolm X was coming from. Also, I'd like to share this with you as well. So when we went to the Umrah last year, and I took my mother for the first time to Umrah, she was in Mecca and she was seeing lots of Nigerian aunties and old people. Every time she was seeing one, she was speaking, "Where do you come from? Where do you come from?" And the first thing she was saying, "Oh my God, it looks like exactly like my black grandmother. That means I'm Nigerian." And then she'll see a Somalian or Sudanese speak to them, and no, my grandmother was like probably from Sudan or Somalia. So you got that kind of solidarity. And the beautiful thing I remember is we was in Medina. We went into the railway museum, which is the old Turkish Ottoman railway, and there's a museum there. And I look behind me, and Mum's missing. Oh no, where is she gone? So I've gone back to one of the rooms, and there's Mum sitting down because she's tired. And there were these African sisters and these Asian young girls massaging her feet. And my mum was saying, look at the respect they give me. And then before you knew it, she found some new friends, and that was her friends on the Umrah. So there is that kind of love and unity in the religion. But as all of you said, if you are prejudiced and racism inside you, then it's something that you need to actually come to terms with. Anyway, a fantastic show. We've gone over 1 hour and 36 minutes today. We shall be back sometime in the middle of the week. For our viewers, please do share this link, and also thanks for contributing to the show. Next week, we're going to have something slightly different. Hopefully, we're going to have 2 of our female members of our groups. So people who are actually active every week are going to be brought onto the show, and we'll have 2 guys. And next week's program is about coming to know your religion, because we know in the last few weeks, in the period of Ramadan and then after Ramadan, we've had lots of people, and we see them every week. They log on, and people have got things to do on the weekend, but they actually make time to watch us and listen to us. So it's going to be our time to actually bring them on so they can tell us their experiences and how they find these shows, and if we are giving them any sort of comfort or spiritual enlightenment. So thank you everyone for being with us again this week. Stay safe, be happy, have a prosperous and good week ahead of you, and Allah Assalamu alaikum. Thank you everyone.